Greetings world. We are anonymous. While thousands of people take part in the anti-government protests in Kiev, a small group of radical fighters were at the core of the violent clashes. And judging by their looks and actions, they are armed, trained, and prepared for war. The hallmark of the Ukrainian riots was the smell of burning tires. Opposition fighters started the fires as the riot police moved in to disperse the crowds in the most brutal action scene. By nightfall, a huge barricade of rubber and flames separated the rioters from police, who returned to their original positions, blocking approaches to governmental buildings. Activists were tossing new tires into the fire in their dozens, as large plumes of black smoke filled the air. There may be no machine gun fire or tanks in Kiev, but the city looks like a war zone. And soldiers of the opposition appear to be a close match to officers of the law, if not in terms of discipline, then certainly in terms of equipment. Riot police have helmets, shields, and body armor. So do the rioters. The radicals are easily distinguished by the orange construction worker helmets many of them wear. But there are also motorcycle helmets, military helmets, and even replica knight helmets. The rioters are armed with homemade shields. Though they may look amateurish compared to police officers' metal ones, they are actually quite effective at blocking rubber bullets. Some have also obtained riot police shields, and they know how to use them to form a tight, well-defended line. Other protection gear includes gas masks that render police tear gas useless. Apart from individual gear, the rioters know urban guerrilla tactics, like stretching nets over barricades to catch police stun grenades. The protesters are also well prepared for offensive. They have a wide assortment of melee weapons. Unlike police batons, their homemade maces and spears have spikes and are designed to draw blood. The most popular projectiles are stones taken from the pavement and Molotov cocktails. Petrol bombs were extensively used in the initial clashes with the police.
This is the scene in Kiev just moments ago, the capital city on fire. And the question right now, who's in control? Why has it suddenly become a tinderbox? And why is America watching so closely? ABC's international correspondent Hamish McDonald on the scene tonight. Hamish.
But tonight, thousands and thousands of protesters are lined up behind these barricades, banging, screaming, taunting security forces to respond. And the only thing that separates them is this thin sheet of ice.
Tonight, Kiev is burning. Through flames and thick smoke, it is clear to see there is no ceasefire in this deadly standoff.
What happens here is they light a Molotov cocktail, throw it in the direction of the police, and then scurry back for protection.
Projectiles fire one after the other. So far, the police are showing restraint. Confronting extreme cold and a government they reject, protesters warm themselves with passion and burning rubber tires. Pitchforks are held high, metal, bats, anything that makes a noise. Their president wants to move closer to Vladimir Putin. He's flexing Russian power. The protesters are led by a former boxing hero who gave up defending his title. He's had some ambitions hosed down, but is fighting for stronger ties with Europe. It's a direct challenge to Putin, as the eyes of the world are on him and his Olympics. These divisions are spreading.
As messy and as chaotic as this battleground looks, the choice for this country is clear. Does it look east towards Russia or towards the west for a very different kind of future?
Some officers hit by the Molotovs were badly burned, and some police vehicles burned out completely. Fireworks were also extensively used against the police, which made the confrontation look hauntingly jubilant at times. The protesters erected a catapult, or more precisely, a miniature trebuchet, to launch their projectiles a great distance. The machine proved to be ineffective and was eventually destroyed in a police raid. The rioters replaced it after with a giant slingshot. The rioters also have pneumatic and low lethality firearms. Only mildly effective against protected police, they may look like real firearms from distance. Where the police beat the opposition is with stun and tear gas grenades. But in one episode, the rioters said they intercepted a box of 340 stun grenades meant for police. It is not clear whether the claim was true. The radical activists stockpiled irritant chemicals, like ammonia, to use against the police as a sort of tear gas. There were also unconfirmed reports that they planned to use Molotov cocktails with concentrated alkaline rain cleaner added so that the bombs not only set their victims on fire, but also left severe chemical burns. It is true that Ukrainian riot police are not beyond criticism. They were involved in deplorable actions, including vicious brutality against unresisting protesters, as footage from the Wednesday crackdown clearly shows. However, many of the people they stand against are far from peaceful and non-violent. They are geared for a guerrilla action, and they are conducting one. We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. To all the corrupt governments on our world, you will be next in line. So expect that.
Aggression is the word that you often hear in the U.S. media and from U.S. officials with regard to Russia's presence in Ukraine. What they fail to show is the aggression. It's very difficult to talk about aggression when you show thousands of people cheering for Russia in different parts of Ukraine, right? Maybe that's why you don't see this kind of footage on U.S. TV very often. But you do see this coverage in which Russia's military presence there in itself is presented as an intervention. What the anchors and pundits often fail to mention is that Russia and Ukraine have an agreement under which Russia is allowed to deploy 25,000 troops in Ukraine. It now has presumably 16,000 or so. So you get a picture where the U.S. presents anything that goes against the interests of those who took power in Kiev as an aggression, and the revolution there as this peaceful takeover of power.
These brave Ukrainians took to the streets in order to stand peacefully against tyranny and to demand democracy. So instead, they were met with snipers who picked them off one after the other.
One wonders if bombarding the police with Molotov cocktails and shooting at them qualifies as standing peacefully, according to Secretary Kerry. A huge part of Ukraine had no say in the power grab at Maidan. Secretary Kerry apparently presents it as a triumph of democracy. We've heard no comments from him on the leaked conversation between the EU Foreign Affairs Chief, Catherine Ashton, and Estonian Foreign Minister, where they talk about evidence that Maidan leaders, not Yanukovych, gave orders to snipers. And the media, on something like this, I mean, you would expect breaking news everywhere. We're talking about evidence that those who are now celebrating victory in Kiev may have well-ordered snipers to shoot both at peaceful protesters and the police. But no, none of that. For hours it went unnoticed because it doesn't fit into the narrative, does it? But what the U.S. media was quick to pick up on were unverified reports like this one.
Robert Seri has agreed to give up his mission here in Ukraine. He is, of course, the UN Special Envoy to Ukraine. He's from the Netherlands, a father of three, and he was taken against his will a short time ago by armed militia.
So after a great deal of hysteria, the UN confirmed the envoy was not kidnapped. But he did come across a group of protesters, and the envoy, who was apparently escorted by police at the time, decided to leave to avoid further tension. The general picture that you get is that of the U.S. mainstream media jumping on anything, verified or unverified, to present Russia as an aggressor without much or any knowledge of what's happening on the ground. And U.S. officials, well, they continue their self-righteous tirade while being engaged in actual acts of aggression around the world, with innocent people dying every day in drone strikes or from violence in countries that were destabilized by the U.S.
Welcome. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. And I'm James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com, and we both welcome you back to another important episode of The New World next week, where we'll begin with the question, did the Fed launder $141 billion through Belgium, and did they do it to hide not the tapering that they claim, but the massive increase in quantitative easing? That's what former Assistant Treasury Secretary and Wall Street Journal editor Paul Craig Roberts alleges. And we can grab this from Washington's blog as well from paulcraigroberts.com. From November 2013 through January 2014, Belgium, with a GDP of $480 billion, purchased $141 billion of U.S. Treasury bonds. Somehow, Belgium came up with enough money to allocate during a 3-month period 29% of its annual GDP to purchase these U.S. Treasury bonds. Certainly, they didn't have a budget surplus of $141 billion. Were they running a trade surplus during that period? No, they are in deficit. Did their central bank print $141 billion in euros to make that purchase? No. Belgium is a member of the euro system, and its central bank cannot increase the money supply. So the question is, where did the $141.2 billion come from? Paul Craig Roberts alleges there is only one source, and that is the Federal Reserve. And the purchase was laundered through Belgium in order to hide the actual fact that the Federal Reserve bond purchases during November 2013 through January 2014 were $112 billion per month. So this seems all complicated. But in other words, during those 3 months, there was a rise in bond purchases by the Fed. The Fed's actual bond purchases for those 3 months are $27 billion per month above the original 85 bill, and on and on. Why did they do this? That's the main question. And again, like anything, we include all the links for you guys to go follow this and do the research for yourself. Why did the Federal Reserve have to purchase so many bonds above the announced amounts, and why did they have to launder and hide the purchase? Again, Craig Roberts alleges some country or countries unknown at this time for reasons we do not know yet dumped $104 billion in U.S. Treasuries in 1 week. James, is this anything we can point to, and there will be relateds that we'll also mention, to show what's going on in the world funny money system?
Well, we do know, for example, at least some of the answers to some of these questions. For example, we know that Russia dumped a record $26 billion of treasury holdings, or 20% of all of its holdings, in March, which they helped to substitute with 900,000 troy ounce purchase of physical gold. That's $1.14 billion of gold to add to their exchange reserves. That's an interesting move right there. But some of these other questions have also been at least partially answered since that original article was written by Paul Craig Roberts. And so we have, for example, from Reuters, Euroclear says likely cause of Belgium's big rise in treasuries. And this Reuters article goes on to say that Belgium-based Euroclear holds assets on behalf of more than 2,000 financial institutions in more than 90 countries, as well as for millions of retail investors. And a spokesman for the company would not comment as to whether there's been a sudden surge of business from customers holding treasuries. The company has about 24.2 trillion euros of all assets in custody. And just to give more insight into Euroclear and who and what they are a, quote, collateral highway that will help market participants move securities from wherever they are held to serve as collateral for access to central bank liquidity, secured transactions such as repos and security loans, and margins for CCPs and bilaterally cleared OTC derivative trades. Oh yes, all perfectly clear now. Basically, yes, this is a clearinghouse that is based in Belgium, and thus this is why it's showing up on Belgium's books. It apparently has nothing to do with the Central Bank of Belgium itself. So what we are seeing here is there are financial institutions that seem to be doing this through the Euroclear collateral highway. That again, we don't know who it is exactly who is buying this, and the speculation that it could be the Federal Reserve directly or indirectly, I guess, still holds. But we have, for example, from Brandon Smith of Alt Market, he just put out an article called "Who is the New Secret Buyer of U.S. Debt?" in which he speculates it's the IMF and or BIS, Bank for International Settlements, that are purchasing U.S. Treasuries through the back door as part of a plan to eventually crash the U.S. Debt market by dumping them all at once, and as part of the Bretton Woods 2 that's going to come along at some some point and rejigger the global financial economy to basically get rid of the dollar as the world reserve. Fanciful argument. It may be true. It may not be true. At this point, all we know is that Euroclear seems to be the point at which these treasuries are being purchased, and we don't know for whom. So that's still an open mystery. But it certainly does mean that without those purchases that have happened in the last 5 months, U.S. treasuries would have been being sold off at a much greater rate than they appear to be at this moment. So someone is propping up U.S. treasuries. And for what purpose? Well, again, to keep the entire global financial system moving along sideways for yet more months or years or however long they continue to pump this up. I guess that remains to be seen. But at any rate, I'm on board with Brandon Smith's ultimate conclusion there that I think there will be a rejiggering of the economy. And he points to 2015, early 2015 is when the IMF is going to look at the special drawing rights basket of exchange currencies that currently includes the euro and the yen and the dollar and the sort of the basic core currencies. China has been lobbying to be included as part of that with their yuan for a while now, and in 2015 they may get their chance, and that might be what some of these central bank purchases of gold is all about. So very, very interesting times on the global financial markets, but unfortunately interesting times can equate to some pretty catastrophic things in the very near future. So we're going to have to keep our eyes on this and see if this treasury purchase continues, and if so, if we can locate where it is coming from and who is doing it for what purpose.
So, as a couple of relateds to this first segment of world finance, let's maybe make it a little simpler, a little sexier. George Soros sold all his shares in Citigroup, Bank of America, and JP Morgan. This coming from Blacklisted News and Market Watch. George Soros dumped his stakes in banks and went for tech and gold miners in the first quarter, according to his filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He sold his holdings in Citigroup, JP Morgan, and Bank of America. Now, dig this. He took new stakes in RF Micro Devices, which designs and manufactures high-performance radio frequency systems, Nuance Communications, a multinational computer software technology corporation that provides speech and imaging applications, Marvell Technology Group, which MarketWatch actually typoed, Marvell Technology Group, they are a producer of storage, communication, and consumer semiconductor products. Nokia Corporation, not just makers of your crappy phones, much more than that. Communications and IT, multinational corporation. And Cypress Semiconductor, another tech firm actually located just down the road from me in Tigard, Oregon. Soros also boosted his stake in Herbalife. More on them in just a second. And he took a new position in Yamana Gold and Alrico Gold and New Gold Incorporated, there being the miners part. If Herbalife sounds familiar to folks out there, it's because just a couple of months ago, we covered that story here on New World Next Week as staking $1 billion that Herbalife will fail and then lobbying to bring it down. Again, this sort of activist investors, if you will. So, James, I think with all of these stories, we see that the same folks that stand to profit, both literally and figuratively, are the ones pushing and moving and funding a lot of this. And the one last related I'll tag on to there, a new global financial order emerging, Putin and the de-dollarization of Russia-China trade. So file that away, but remember it. As we move to our second story, and that's when we bring out, as they call it on the interwebs, the Godwin. Prince Charles's Hitler row risks triggering an international scandal. That's right. Prince Charles, heir apparent to the British throne, declares Putin on par with Hitler. The prince caused controversy when he told a woman in Canada that the Russian president is doing just about the same as Hitler in annexing Crimea to the Ukraine. In the Ukraine, rather. Charles, who is scheduled to meet Vladimir Putin at the D-Day commemorations in France on June 6th, just a couple of weeks away, made his well-intentioned but unguarded comment during a visit to the Canadian Museum of Immigration in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It was heard by several witnesses. Mrs. Marianne Ferguson, whom Charles was speaking to and who had fled the Holocaust with her family, losing some, said, quote, "I must say that I agree with him, and I'm sure a lot of people do. I was very surprised that he made the comment, as I know they aren't meant to say these things, but it was very heartfelt and honest." So there are several other links that we'll include. Prince Charles should abdicate after comparing Putin to Hitler, says one MP in the UK. Meanwhile, other MPs are fiercely defending him. And James, why is this story such an ironic chuckle?
Well, let's get to that in a moment, but first we should also point out that this is just part of a continuing series of such statements. For example, back in March, Hillary Clinton herself said that there are echoes of Hitler in Putin's annexation of Crimea. And back in April, Forbes.com contributor Paul Johnson made a similar claim. Is Vladimir Putin another Adolf Hitler? So just like clockwork, here's May's contribution to the latest boogeyman pylon, which we see in the wake of, or in the lead up to every international confrontation in our modern era. And it's so predictable. It is absolutely, I mean, it's just atrociously boring at this point. Oh, he's another Hitler. Is he? Tell us again. So again, this is not surprising that this has been brought out at all. But yes, you're right. It's particularly ironic that the royals are now comparing Putin to Hitler, given that the royals were, of course, unabashedly supporters of Hitler and the Nazi regime, including, of course, not only Prince Charles's father, Prince Philip, who was buddy-buddy with the Nazis and appeared at various wedding festivities flanked by Nazis and things of this nature, but also Prince Charles's son, Prince Harry, who showed up at a party wearing a swastika. Because, oh, isn't that so funny and wacky? So yeah, please, Mr. Charles, tell us again who's just like Hitler.
I think that's the thing. So basically, you break it down, and I'll include a years-old article from Lee Rogers that notes the British monarchy has its roots in Nazism, or perhaps vice versa. That the British monarchy, combined with London banksters, helped fund Hitler and build up the Nazi war machine. Why? To fight Russia and to consolidate power, which will bring us back to the very beginning of all of these things that we see with the first two stories, one feeding the other. James, I don't think there's anything left to do but perhaps look at some good news in our third and final segment, and that's sometimes how we've been doing it more often than not anymore here on New World Next Week, because we find both, I think, ourselves and all the folks out there, the audience and the folks who help give us content by using hashtag New World Next Week or even hashtag Good News Next Week. It can't be bad news all the time, and we have to try and celebrate some of these victories, small or pyrrhic as they may seem sometimes. So we'll begin again in my own backyard. We'll call this the Good News Next Week U.S. Selections Edition. 2 Oregon counties ban GMO crops amid U.S. labeling uproar. Even Reuters reported voters in 2 small Oregon counties on Tuesday approved controversial ballot measures to ban the cultivation of genetically engineered crops within their boundaries. Also, the Washington Times noted residents in a southwest Oregon county voted emphatically to ban genetically engineered crops following a campaign that attracted a bushel of out-of-state money. A pair of competing campaigns, meaning the pro and the con, raised $1.3 million to sway Jackson County's 120,000 registered voters. $1 million of that, the lion's share of that money, was raised to defeat the proposed ban. Who were the companies? Monsanto, Syngenta, and DuPont that combined to contribute nearly $400,000. They spent $1 million to try and convince the people there, the farmers there, what they should do. There are other links, and even Russia Today covered it. There's a video report, and it's something I actually talked about briefly with a guest I interviewed today on my own Food World Order, the author Vicki Robin, who has a book called Blessing the Hands That Feed Us, about eating locally. So, James, some of our other positive notes: as Common Core becomes a punchline, critics win battles nationwide. That comes from thenewamerican.com. South Carolina lawmakers pass bill effectively nullifying the federal hemp ban. And not a selection note, but after the bin Laden backlash, the Central Intelligence Agency has promised, James, no more vaccination campaigns for spying. Any thoughts on that?
Yay! Wow, they're not going to do fake vaccination campaigns, or at least not that they'll tell us about. Yeah, interesting. Well, I would just like to draw people back to that Washington Times article we were reading from about the Oregon Improves GMO ban, because again, encoded in the language of this is the type of propaganda which now is the mainstream norm, and this is just included in every story on the matter. So for example, they say towards the end of the article, though genetically engineered crops are common and no mainstream science has shown they are unsafe, opponents contend GMOs are still experimental and promote the use of pesticides. They say more testing is needed, as if all of these things are random weird assertions coming out of nowhere by these faceless opponents who we are of course supposed to differentiate ourselves from. Every single part of that is wrong. There is data and science to back up the fact that pesticide use is increasing as a direct result of these GMOs, and there is mainstream science, including a list of, I don't even remember how many scientists that came out last year in defense of Seralini, saying that the science is absolutely not settled about GMOs, and of course when people look into how GMOs are approved and the fact that it's all self-reporting from these companies that stand to gain profit directly from their sales of these crops, yeah, there's a bit of backdoor shenanigans going on, do you think? So it's good to see that even despite this coordinated propaganda campaign, people are still rejecting it. People know that there's something wrong, and hopefully we will see more and more of this, as we have not only in Oregon, but also Russia recently trying to ban GMO imports. So hopefully this is the thin edge of a wedge of a large trend that's developing, and hopefully we can help to push that idea further out into the mainstream that's so coveted by these headline writers.
James, just in closing, we'll briefly mention just a couple of the other stories that folks have submitted on Twitter using hashtag New World Next Week, like our friends Twisted Politics and Dazalt Theory and others. The FBI is headhunting computer hackers who love weed. Bilderberg's silent takeover of Britain's $60 billion defense budget, and a really interesting one from Max Kaiser, bankers killing bankers for the insurance money. And another look at 9/11, as James will also note that, I don't have this in the notes, the guilty plea, or rather the guilty verdict just recently on Abu Hamza. That's what it is. I'll add that to the note, and that therefore updates other stories we've tracked on New World Next Week.
Excellent stuff, and I'm looking forward to listening to that Food World Order interview. So on that note, let's wrap it up there. James, looking forward to next week.
All right. Thanks so much.
Welcome. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
And I'm James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com, and this is the New World Next Week. So much developing and important news to get through this week, James, so let's jump right to it. And we'll preface a lot of what we're reporting for you this week as we come to you recording in the early morning hours, at least on the Western Hemisphere, of February 27th, as Russia puts military on high alert as Crimea protests leave one man dead. This coming from The Guardian. The Kremlin ordered major military exercises as concerns about unrest in Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula continue to grow, and scuffles in the region left one person, again at the time of this reporting, dead. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an urgent drill of his country's armed forces in Western Russia in what appeared to be a display of saber-rattling aimed at the new government in Kiev. The U.S. reacted in a strongly worded message, with the Secretary of State, occult fraternity member, war crimes cover-up artist John Kerry saying that any military intervention in Ukraine would be a quote-unquote grave mistake. James, the developing story, which is really only over an hour or so old as I come to you here, armed men seize government headquarters and raise the Russian flag in Ukraine's Crimea. So again, I don't have a whole lot to give you right now on that developing story, but it's all over RT and the BBC, and of course it'll take much longer to reach the Western media here, James.
That's right, of course, as always, but it is interesting to note, at this point, all we know is that so far something like 50 or 60 people have stormed the Parliament building and taken it over for the time being, and this is developing, so undoubtedly this story will be somewhere else by the time this video comes to you. But I think that the point here is that we can see the trajectory of what's happening right now, and it's interesting. It was less than 24 hours ago I was on the line talking to William Engdahl about what's happening in Ukraine, and he was talking specifically about about how he foresees this developing into at least potentially developing into a civil war type scenario where Ukraine gets divided along the east-west between the larger ethnic Russian population and linguistically Russian population in the east, and then the western ethnic Ukrainian population. He was talking about that very scenario, and then I hung up after talking to him, checked the news, and lo and behold, the Crimean conflicts between the two sides had already claimed one life. So I think we're starting to see the beginning. It's important not to just dismiss this as part and parcel of what's been happening in Ukraine. I think this is the beginning of the next stage of what's happening in Ukraine. And we are seeing the potential division of Ukraine right now. We are starting to see the civil war type scenario that Engdahl was talking about coming to fruition, at least potentially. And so much of this, of course, depends on the way Russia reacts to this and to the way that the US, NATO, EU bloc reacts to this and what they end up doing. For people who haven't checked out my conversation with William Engdahl, I hope they do so. It has a lot of important information. And also, just a couple of days ago, I was talking to Paul Craig Roberts on this. That's also up on my website. I also talked to Michelle Chossudovsky briefly the other day. That's not up on my website yet, but will be part of a background or GRTV video I'm working on. So a lot more to say about what's happening in the Ukraine right now. And unfortunately, this looks like the beginnings of the potential division of the country.
And a lot of links and a lot of related updates that we'll include in our posting. And of course, as always, all the sources cited will be linked for you to go do your own research for folks out there. Another interesting one, James. Russian warship docked in Havana without explanation. Meanwhile, it was speculated that the minute Sochi wrapped up, that Russia would kind of flex its muscles, and we'll include other links to stories. Russia expanding its worldwide military presence, drilling ground troops at Ukraine's doorstep. And James, fortunately, we lived up to our name, New World Next Week, over a month ago when right here we led the show asking the question, who is behind the Ukrainian riots? So having said that, and again, having given folks the caveat that so much of this is developing, we'll move to our second set of stories this week, James, which also features some bit of developing news and something that we've talked about over the last several years. And we even wrapped up last year by, I believe it was myself saying, I thought 2013 was sort of the year of Bitcoin, and Bitcoin story ceases to go away. And we thank our friend on Twitter at GJ Salisbury for covering this story and using hashtag New World Next Week. Bitcoin under threat as Mt. Gox goes offline. However, the latest we can give you will come from dailydot.com that notes new exchange will put Bitcoin regulation in the hands of Wall Street bankers. Reports of Bitcoin's demise, it would seem, have been greatly exaggerated. Amid accusations of gross incompetence and the theft of an absurd figure, one of the world's largest exchanges, Bitcoin exchanges, was sundered this week. For the most part, however, Bitcoin was able to recover its market cap, even though in some media remained hysterical, prophesying the end of times for this cryptocurrency. In this article on Daily Dot, it is noted, as someone says, if Gmail shut down, we wouldn't be claiming the end of email. So continuing, mere hours after the Japan-based Mt. Gox, G-O-X, seemingly vanished from the internet, a new exchange was unexpectedly announced. Second Market, an alternative online marketplace currently operating the world's largest Bitcoin investment vehicle, declared its intention to introduce a fully regulated Bitcoin trading hub. The decision to announce, according to founder and CEO Barry Silbert, was directly influenced by the turmoil surrounding Mt. Gox. James, the article goes on and it gets more into the nitty-gritty and developing situation of this Bitcoin situation. And again, we'll include a lot of related links as the price stays resilient, as it is make or break time. And again, just as we noted at the very beginning, the reports of the demise may have been greatly exaggerated. James.
That is true, and I think that there's a nuance to this story that we have to bring in here, and that's that basically the Bitcoin true believers who are out there trying to stress this point, of course, Mt. Gox isn't the Bitcoin protocol, they're not one and the same, this isn't the end of Bitcoin. they are technically correct and factually wrong. And what I mean by that is to say that really at this point we're starting to see the formation of two Bitcoins. Not in reality, not technically, there is not two different Bitcoin protocols or anything like that, but we have the Bitcoin that the true believers and the early adopters and the people, the tech geeks and the people who've been on this since the beginning have always wanted, which is the and not anonymous, nothing online is really anonymous, but you can make it more anonymous, shall we say, and decentralized and the cryptocurrency that can be used for agoristic purposes to get around government regulation, etc. And then there's the Bitcoin that is slowly starting to make its way into the mainstream narrative, which is being sold to the public. And this Mt. Gox issue, of course, it doesn't affect the Bitcoin protocol overall, but it does affect the way that Bitcoin interfaces with the mainstream, the way that 99.9999 repeating percent of humanity is understands Bitcoin is through the headlines they read and what they see in the newspaper. So yes, what happened to Mt. Gox isn't important in terms of Bitcoin itself, but it is important in terms of the public face of Bitcoin, and that is important because obviously we're seeing the tentative steps towards Bitcoin becoming a currency that can actually be used in more and more places. I think that really what this is kind of an existential crisis for Bitcoin. Does it want to be that mainstream currency that as the Daily Dot article goes on to mention, and I hope people will read through this because there's some important information down in the middle of that article about this second market exchange. Basically, this is going to be bringing in Wall Street regulation and a FINRA type board to try to make it all mainstream respectable, et cetera, et cetera. They're going to pump in tens of millions of dollars to set this up. So Bitcoin will be fine and it will continue to thrive, but it will do so in a more regulated environment. And again, the early adopters and the tech geeks can get around that, and they can store their own wallet on their hard drives and in cold storage, and people know how to do that if they're already involved in this. But I'm telling you, for the vast majority of humanity who have no idea what Bitcoin even is, they're not going to get on board unless and until it becomes mainstreamized. And I think that's kind of the undermining of the principles, which is what made it such an attractive thing to people in the first place. And that's why we're seeing the hundreds and billions of other cryptocurrencies springing up now, and everything from Namecoin to Dogecoin to all of the other things, because again, Bitcoin is not the only game in town anymore. So it's an existential crisis. There's a lot to say about this. I'm going to obviously have to continue covering this in more detail. And just for the Bitcoin true believers who want to throw rotten eggs at me because I dared to say something that doesn't sound 100% positive about Bitcoin, I am on your side. I do think that there needs to be this type of complementary currency out there. I just think that there's some problems with the way this is developing. And what happens in the mainstream, I understand. We don't care, but it does affect the way that this actually functions in the real world.
We could speculate, I think, a lot, James, about what exactly went down here and whether or not or how it exactly plays as almost a psychological operation to folks out there watching the nightly news. They're being reassured, don't worry, that crazy internet money isn't going to do anything. Just keep the green bills in your pocket. That's speculation on my part. But we will include, again, links for more on this story and links to my own Media Monarchy as well as Cyberspace War archive of Bitcoin stories throughout the last few years. James, as we
just before we get off the topic, I should throw in an alt link as well to a discussion on Reddit that I think points out this schism that's taking place perfectly right now, where you have some people arguing that what we need is more transparency, more security, and then there's other people saying, well, that's exactly what Bitcoin was supposed to avoid in the first place. So I see the schism happening right now, and I'll throw in that link so people can read through that thread about it.
All right. On that note, James, our third and final story this week, I think, is a nice follow-up to our previous episode of New World Next Week. And again, hopefully at our best, we're giving you the next week and next year kind of ideas and stories that you'll see. Whether it's truth or whether it's prediction or reality or false will all remain to be seen. The story we covered just a couple of weeks ago was the software that can predict the future. However, there's something a whole lot simpler that a lot of us are already using and that we've already discussed. Can Twitter prevent major events? A new study says yes. We get this from the fine folks at Red Ice Creations by way of Fast Company. Twitter is great for spoiling things like the Olympics, but can the social network's data-gathering ways be used to predict big, potentially world-shaking events like mass protests, for example? The short answer, according to a new study, is a resounding sometimes. Nathan Callis, a PhD student at MIT, analyzed thousands of tweets associated with the 2013 coup in Egypt and claims that the social unrest associated with it was, in fact, predictable ahead of time. For his research, Callis mined data from more than 300,000 public information sources, including New York Times, countless blogs, and, of course, social media to predict crowd behavior. Quote, with public information becoming widely accessible and shared on today's web, greater insights are possible into crowd actions by citizens and non-state actors such as large protests and cyber activism, end quote, he writes, which makes sense. If protesters in Egypt use social media to physically mobilize their efforts, something like Twitter could provide a hazy window into potential history. One major caveat of the numerous caveats we've offered in this episode 183 of New World Next Week, James, is that this study has the luxury of peering backwards into 2013. Twitter, as it stands, still has not been used to accurately predict an event in the future. James, interestingly enough, and thankfully enough, this research from Nathan Callis is available, and you can read the PDF, and we'll include that link, Predicting Crowd Behavior with Big Public Data. And to see, and it's not just Twitter, we'll give you a story from TechDirt as well, as the Chicago Police Department believes it can see the future and starts warning citizens on their heat list about crimes they might commit. James.
Well, again, these are great snapshots of kind of the bigger theme that we've been talking about here, and I think this is just an example of the types of data streams that can be fed into something like that Ward Lab prediction software that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. And if Twitter alone can be predictive in certain respects, imagine Twitter plus Google searches plus all of these other social media and other feeds and other data streams that can be collected now relatively easily and centralized. And if and when that happens, I mean, imagine the predictive value of that. So we've already seen the phenomenon. For example, Google says it can predict flu outbreaks, etc., just by the search terms that it's receiving and geolocating those search terms. So we already know that this phenomenon exists, but it is good to be reminded of it and how powerful it is. And this goes back to the fundamental point that, again, there is so much data that is being put online these days that that it really is becoming a reality that at the very least, short-term predictability of certain events is really skyrocketing, and I think longer-term trends is also is going up. So I think it's important to understand that, again, the value of the data that you're putting into these systems, even just from a dollars and cents perspective for the corporations that would love to be able to have this type of predictive ability for all sorts of different reasons, let alone the ways that this can be used by governments, and already is being used, I have no doubt, by DARPA in the bowels of the Pentagon to predict all of the various, all of the ways that they can use this to predict riots and how much the public will take, etc., etc. So again, these are great snapshots of that greater point.
James, in wrapping up this episode, I think it's interesting to note, just as we see all of these developing stories going on around the world, just as an esoteric note, I found it really interesting that yesterday, February 26th, and tomorrow, the 27th, respectively, was the 20th anniversary of the passing of the legendary Bill Hicks, who we'll call Saint Hicks, and also the 21st anniversary on the 26th of the 93 bombing of the World Trade Center. And as the sun dawns on the 27th, it will be the anniversary of the Reichstag fire. So I think all of these things that we see, these events kind of swirling around, we should keep in the back of our minds as we're looking at the latest news. So in closing, we'll again remind you and implore you to use hashtag New World Next Week, like our pre-mentioned at GJ Salisbury, our good friend Brock West, but also other folks that are picking up the baton and using it at Citizens Gateway and at Daz Alt Theory, and all the other folks out there using hashtag New World Next Week to submit stories. And again, this is why we do this, to share this information in an open source kind of way, James.
Sure is. Well, I'm looking forward to next week. Thank you again for your time today, James.
Thanks so much.